Thank you. Well, I want to say thank you to all of you for allowing me to come and speak to you this morning. It's certainly a privilege for me to do so. Thank you to Brother Dave for the opportunity as well. As he mentioned, I'm a student at the seminary, so usually my summers are pretty busy with classes, homework, studying, reading, and all that. But this summer, I had a change up in my schedule and I didn't take any classes. So I thought I was going to have a little bit more of a relaxing semester. However, that wasn't the case at all with other responsibilities I had with work, family, and other things to fulfill my obligations at the school. I've been really, really busy this summer. My wife and I, she stays home with our two little boys. The oldest is Hosea. He's 3 years old, and our youngest one is Ezra. He just turned 1 in May. So she's been busy, I've been busy. So we've not had much time to relax. And it wasn't until a couple of nights ago I finally had a moment to relax. And I did one of the things that I love to do when I have free time, and I watched a movie. And this movie that I watched was about a man. It took place in 1947, about a man who was sentenced to a double life sentence in prison for killing his wife and her lover. And although he claimed that he did not kill his wife and her lover, there was no evidence to prove otherwise. So because of this, he was sent to a prison to serve a double life sentence for the crime. Now in this prison, it was known to be a cold, dark, horrible prison where there was corruption amongst the inmates. But that's no surprise, right? They're criminals. They're there because they're usually corrupt people. But the corruption was also amongst the guards. The corruption didn't stop there. There was corruption with the prison warden as well. It was a horrible prison. It was a cold prison. There was wickedness in this prison. The purpose of this prison was to make sure that all of the inmates lose sight of hope and forget about the outside world. It was a prison that's purpose was to squeeze every ounce of hope from the inmate. In fact, any talk of hope and of getting out was looked down on by all the other inmates. To talk about hope in this horrible place was foolish. And you know, we live in a type of prison as well. We live in a prison called earth. Earth is a corrupt place. It is a wicked place. It is a cold place. And there's corruption all around us. In fact, you could turn on the TV and watch the news and you find quickly that we live in a horrible world. We live in a place where there is wickedness and there is sadness and there is mourning and there is brokenness all around us. In fact, one of my professors, he proves the point that the world is broken in the mere fact that babies die. Now, I apologize for sounding so dull and so horrible this morning, but it's the reality of the life that we live in. In fact, this past year and a half with experiences of COVID-19 and the pandemic shutting down the whole world, you realize quickly that we live in a cold world. We live in a horrible world, a broken world, a world where it seems like there is no hope. And if you're not careful, even as believers, we could begin to forget about the hope that we have in Jesus Christ. And so the question that I want to talk about today, and I hope to answer, is how do we live today in this cold, broken world in light of the hope that is to come tomorrow? How do we live today with suffering all around us, with brokenness surrounding us, in light of the hope that is to come tomorrow? Now, if you turn your Bibles with me, if you have them with you, if not, it's perfectly fine, to the book of Zephaniah, we're going to find out what the prophet says about how we live today in this dark, corrupt world in light of the hope that we have tomorrow. The book of Zephaniah is one of the last books of the Old Testament. In fact, it's probably easier if you start off at Matthew in the New Testament, work your way back to find it. But Zephaniah chapter 3, and beginning in verse 14, we're going to discover how it is that we live today in light of tomorrow. Before we get to there, just so that we understand what the message of the prophet Zephaniah is that he is speaking to a wicked nation of Israel. He is speaking about the rebellion that is going on and how God is going to come and overthrow them because they have turned away from him. They have despised him. They have lifted their fists in anger towards him and gone off to worship other gods. Those who have not gone off completely have found that it is okay to merge the worship of false idols with the worship of the one true God, a thing that is detestable to God. And because of this, the prophet Zephaniah speaks this word to the people to tell them of the destruction that is going to come because of their wickedness. There is corruption in the nation of Israel. There is wickedness all around them. And he is bringing a message of destruction from God himself. But when we get to chapter 3, there is a message of hope, where those people who have not turned away from God are given a promise of a restoration and a time of peace and a time of relaxation, a time completely different to a time of corruption. So in verse 14, the first thing that we find that the prophet Zephaniah says is that we live today in light of tomorrow by being joyful for what's to come. How we live today in light of the hope that we have tomorrow is that we live with joy for what is to come. He begins in verse 14 of chapter 3, and he says, "Shout for joy, O daughter of Zion. Shout in triumph, O Israel. Rejoice and exult with all your heart, O daughter of Jerusalem." The prophet here begins by using poetry to announce to the people of Israel, to the humble people, the people who have been faithful to God, of the hope that is to come to them. Notice that he begins by telling them, shout out in joy. Shout out in joy. Shout out in exaltation. Shout out for what's to come, he says. Now I want you to understand, these people are living in a time of wickedness. And they've just heard a message of destruction, but then they are told to rejoice. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't be very happy if I was told that the country was going to be destroyed because of its wickedness. I wouldn't be very happy. But he tells them, shout for joy. And then he calls them two things. He calls them daughter of Zion. Zion was the place where the presence of God rested. Zion was the place where God came down and spoke to Moses. That was the place where God dwelt. And by calling these people, O daughter of Zion, it meant that they were inhabitants of the dwelling place of God. These were the people who were faithful to God, who while everybody else was turning away, who while everybody else was worshiping this idol and this idol and this idol, oh, and don't forget about Yahweh, these people were faithful to only serving God. He says, shout in triumph, O Israel. Rejoice and exult with all your heart. He says now, O daughter of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the place, was the city of David, where David made the capital of Israel. Jerusalem was the place where the king sat. And by calling these people daughters of Jerusalem, is that they were inhabitants of the place where the king's throne resided. He goes on in verse 15 and says, the Lord has taken away his judgments against you. He has cleared away your enemies. Now I want you to understand, here, anytime there is a mention of judgment and enemies, the enemies are seen as the way that God would judge the people. In fact, we have, whenever the Israelites would turn away from God, the way that God would bring judgment is that first he would have the Assyrians come in and wipe out the people and take them captive. Then he had the Babylonians come in, wipe them out, and take them captive. So the way that God would judge his people was by sending an enemy to come and take them away. But now, The prophet is saying that God is taking away this judgment. He is removing the enemies from their midst. They are no longer captive and are no longer bound, but can return and live in the place where God dwells and where the king will sit on his throne. And he's telling them to rejoice for this. And he goes on and says, the King of Israel, the Lord is in your midst. You will fear disaster no more. So remember again, the people of Israel are living in a wicked time, are told of a destruction that's to come, but then they're told to rejoice. Because at the end of all of these things, after God wipes away all of their enemies, God will be with their people, with his people, and they will be with their God. It's a moment of suffering going on, a moment of brokenness, a moment of fear. But the prophet says, rejoice because of what's to come. Rejoice today for what's to come. We could rejoice today because one day there will be no more brokenness. There will be no more wickedness. There will be no more corruption. And there will be true peace. The absence of brokenness in this world and the presence of God with us. Where the book of Revelation says, he will be our God and we will be his people. And he will wipe away every tear from our eyes. There will be no more need for a sun because God's light will shine for us. See, let me make it a little bit more applicable to us today. The movie The Wizard of Oz, I'm sure you've all seen it. About Dorothy and her dog Toto who get captured out of Kansas into this mysterious city called Oz. And Dorothy often says, Toto, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore. And the entire movie is about her trying to get back home. How does she get back home? Well, the people of Oz, they tell her, well, if you follow this yellow brick road, you'll get to the Wizard of Oz. And the Wizard of Oz could solve your problems. So off she goes, following down the yellow brick road to find her way to the Wizard of Oz so that he could hopefully find her home. On her way, she meets 3 other people, a scarecrow, a lion, and a tin man, all of which have a problem as well. One needs courage, one needs a brain, one needs a heart. But she tells each of them, I'm off to see the wizard, the wonderful Wizard of Oz. He could solve my problems. So they all join her. They all have a problem, they all join her. And as they're going off to see the wizard, the wonderful Wizard of Oz, they're singing with joy. We're off to see the wizard, the wonderful Wizard of Oz. Because even though they had a problem at that moment, they knew they were on their way to meet the one who could fix their problem. We have a problem today, but we know that one day God is going to come and sit on his throne in the form of Jesus Christ, will take on the throne in Jerusalem, and he will be our God, and we will be his people. And even though we have pain and suffering and brokenness today, we can be with joy, knowing that one day he will wipe away our pain. Not only does the prophet Zephaniah tell us that we are to be joyful for what's to come, he goes on to say that we could be comforted for what's to come. He goes on in verse 16 and says, in that day it will be said to Jerusalem, do not be afraid, O Zion. Do not let your hands fall limp. I want you to note that this phrase, in that day, is used 2 or 3 other times in this book. But the 2 or 3 other times that it's used by the prophet, it's a message of destruction where the prophet says, on that day, and he describes the destruction that's to come. But now he's changed it and says, in that day, and he brings a message of comfort to the people. He says, it will be said to Jerusalem, do not be afraid, O Zion. Do not let your hands fall limp. This picture of hands falling limp is an image of hands that are discouraged. A picture of hands that don't want to work anymore. A picture of hands that says, why should I build? Why should I do? Why should I create if my enemy is just going to come and destroy it all? But here the prophet Zephaniah is saying, do not let your hands be limp. Because while the king is in their midst, there will be peace. It's the removal of wickedness and removal of destruction, the removal of war, and the integration of peace, because the king will be there. And when the king is there, nobody's going to mess with them. He goes on in verse 17, the Lord your God is in your midst, a victorious warrior. It's one who goes off to battle and wins. A victorious warrior, one who goes and everybody knows that he's going to win. He says, he will exult over you with joy. He will be quiet in his love. He will rejoice over you with shouts of joy. Here, the prophet is now using wedding night imagery, where the bridegroom would meet his bride, and the joy that he would feel for seeing her. And that is the way that God will feel on that day. So it's almost like the people will be rejoicing, and it's not that God's going to be bored just wanting to go somewhere else, but he's going to be excited to be there as well. It's not like if you run into a celebrity and you want to shake their hand, take a picture with them, and they just look bored out of their mind. But it's a mutual rejoicing and a mutual excitement for being there. God will be excited for being with us. We will certainly be excited for being with him, but he will be excited for being with us. And because of this, the prophet says that we could take comfort. A lesson that I learned from a little redhead orphan girl named Annie. She said that whenever she was feeling alone and in despair and sad, she would sing a song. I'm not going to sing it, but the song says, the sun will come out tomorrow. Bet your bottom dollar that tomorrow there will be sun. Just thinking about tomorrow clears away the cobwebs and the sorrow till there's none. When I'm stuck in a day that's gray and lonely, I just stick out my chin and grin and say, the sun will come out tomorrow. So you gotta hang on till tomorrow, come what may. Tomorrow, tomorrow, I love you tomorrow. You're always a day away. We can live today in the comfort of tomorrow. And the fact that it's not only God wiping away our tears, but it's God also removing that which will cause tears. It's a day when there will be no more nurses. A day when there will be no more doctors. A day when you'll no longer have to take medicine. A day when you won't have to worry about your children and your grandchildren who are probably rebelling. It'll be a day when you could wake up with joy and comfort in knowing that you're with God and God is with you. We could be joyful for what's to come, and we could be comforted in what's to come. In 1947, Andy Dufresne was sentenced to a double life sentence for killing his wife and her lover. And even though he claimed that he was innocent, there was no evidence to prove that he was. So he was sent to Shawshank prison, where he would serve his time. And like I said, Shawshank was a nasty place. All of the inmates there forgot about the outside world. But Andy Dufresne was different. Andy spent from the first day in this prison thinking about the outside. 20 years after being sentenced to Shawshank prison, Andy Dufresne escaped. The reason why Andy Dufresne was able to escape the prison was because from day one, he always thought of outside. We could live with joy today and comfort today because of the tomorrow that's ahead of us. Thank you.